Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Mount. I am a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California Water Policy Center and a former professor from UC Davis. I want to thank you for inviting me to the Water Resources Conference. And I'm in the unenviable position to be talking about water in a place where I don't know a lot about the water. So to avoid that, any problems there, I will talk about California water today. And from that, in our long history of conflict over water in California, there may be some useful things for those of you working on the ACF and the internecine conflicts that are occurring around it, which of course we are following on the West Coast. So some pretty important law may come out of your area. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of an overview of water management in California, Water 101, we can call it that. And then I'm going to zero down on what I think, I'm going to ignore a lot of this and zero down on what is the essence of the problem as I see it in terms of management today. So I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but it's to get to a few key points. And some of the remedies that we're exploring and have explored may be of value in folks working in the ACF and the kinds of actions that may be needed in the future. So of course, this is a Zoom, and if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So that's a universal truism. All right, let me just start with the basics here. The thing you really do have to understand about California and California water management. When it comes to precipitation, there is no more variable place in North America, certainly in the coterminous United States. Now, there's more variable weather, particularly when you look at places like Texas. But in terms of annual and interannual variability in precipitation, California is the king. It's quite dramatic. I mean, and keep in mind, we have this variability takes place with Noachian deluges associated with our atmospheric rivers, which are as big as your hurricanes in terms of the amount of precipitation that comes into the state. And on the flip side of this, we have two droughts. We have the annual drought, which starts in May when it stops raining and then ends hopefully in November when it starts to rain again. Although I'm going to get to the changes that are going on there. And then, of course, we have our interannual droughts. And typically in the last 150 years, there really hasn't been more than 6 consecutive years of dry to very dry conditions. So our droughts are relatively short-lived. But I'm going to make the point that, in fact, our droughts are much longer than that. And we're, in fact, in the middle of a pretty bad one right now. So the key is adaptation. It's all about adaptation, what we do to basically to adapt to these changes in conditions, this annual drought and interannual drought that comes along, and of course these occasional floods. And our adaptation is investments, pretty massive investments in surface storage. That's a big deal. So we have more than 1,400 reservoirs that can capture and control about 1 year's worth of water use. So that's obviously too little, so that's only part of our storage package in California. We also rely heavily on snowpack as part of our storage. One of the things to really monitor is that what's the volume of water in our reservoirs and how much is in our snowpack, because that's transient storage that is added on top of our reservoirs. And of course, this is absolutely key on the west slope of the Sierra Nevada, where most of California's developed water comes from. So this is key. And of course, I've just put on here two things from Mike Dettinger, where we are now, and we're in deep trouble. We're in the second year of a bad drought, and things are looking bad. And we just had a big drought in 2012 through 2016, and so the alarm bells are starting to ring already. We haven't really ever recovered from that drought, particularly when it comes to groundwater, part of our package. The other thing we do is we have extraordinary conveyance systems. And we're able to move water vast distances in California because 75% of the precipitation falls north of Sacramento and 75% of the water use is south of Sacramento. And so without that, we're in we're in deep trouble. So conveyance is absolutely critical. And in fact, conveyance is playing a greater and greater role toward one of the things that we're using to manage water, which is water trading. So the ability to move water around is absolutely key. I mean, in fact, we get water from the west slope of the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming that comes down the Colorado River and makes it into Southern California. And then we get water all the way from the Oregon border as well. So these conveyance systems are absolutely critical to managing drought. But this combination of surface storage and conveyance just goes so far. After about 2 to 3 years of consecutive dry conditions, this is an example of the way a reservoir, the blue line is essentially reservoir storage for the bigger reservoirs during the last drought. You basically deplete surface storage, and we are living on what little water comes in during relatively dry winters, and things become pretty dire after the third year in terms of surface storage. And so we have to go to our other storage, which is groundwater. And groundwater is critical. It is the drought storage in California. On a typical average year, it accounts for about 30% of supply. And during droughts, it gets up to 65% of supply. So it's absolutely critical. And of course, managing groundwater is part of our great challenge in California. In fact, it's quite a great challenge in California. But it isn't just the infrastructure. It's actually a suite of some call Byzantine laws, others just call them bizarre, but a series of laws that have been established since the arrival of the first settlers. I mean, since the Spanish were there, and have evolved over time. And basically, we have what we call our modern, which was developed in 1913, our modern water rights system, which is specifically designed to manage water allocation during times of great scarcity. And of course, we're very famous for our prior appropriation rule, which the rest of the world calls first in time, first in right. If you were the first one there and you used it, you have a right to continue to use it, which is your prior appropriation right, meaning people came later. When it comes to cutting water, we cut the last in line first. And so that the senior water rights holders are the last to be cut. And this gets wickedly complicated and beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about today, including riparian rights and very senior rights before the 1913 water law. And there is a bevy of lawyers who manage this on a daily basis, who are making fine livings out of this complex system we put in place. We also have a couple of other aspects which are important to remember. There's no waste or unreasonable use allowed, meaning the state can determine that what you're doing is waste and unreasonable use, and as shown, and the courts have given them a lot of deference in the past. There is a bizarre part of this that it's just use it or lose it. You lose your place in line if you don't use the water, which is an incentive to make wasteful use of it. And there's a whole lot more. Now, over the last 20 years, water markets and trading is turning out to be a big deal for dealing with scarcity. So that's important and increasing. And of course, what's been picked up in the newspapers is the fact that we've got water futures trading going on, which yes, we do, but it's a minuscule amount of water in California, and not really worth hyperventilating about. And then, of course, there are the social and environmental adaptations as well, which are sometimes viewed as a constraint on this system rather than something fully integrated within it. But, you know, like a non-native species, it's been naturalized in it. So day-to-day management, of course, the Federal Endangered Species Act, the California, and its parallel, the California Endangered Species Act. Of course, we have the Federal Clean Water Act, which is really important, and the California equivalent, California Porter Cologne Act, which basically we manage a lot of that within the nation state of California manages a lot of that on its own. And there's this other aspect that California water is a public trust resource. It means nobody owns it. They just own a right to use it. And because it's a public trust resource, we have the State Water Resources Control Board who tries to balance the uses of water. Goes to great lengths to balance the uses of water. So that's an important aspect as well. And all of this is this ecosystem of water management, if you want to call it that, I mean, which is all integrated: surface storage, groundwater storage, the two storages connected to conveyance systems that move water vast distances, and use of the water is ruled by a water rights system, a complex water rights system, and of course a series of state and federal laws, particularly the environmental regulations within it. So that's kind of the context. That's how we, California, have adapted to this incredibly variable climate. I mean, variable in space and time. It is, we have temperate rainforests in the North Coast, and places that near the New River in the Colorado deserts get 2 inches of rain a year. So it's tremendous gradients within California, and this is how we have adapted to it. Now, there's one other thing I do want to say, because you hear about this all the time, and I just want to remind you, where does the water go? Who uses it? Who uses it and how much? This is often a state of political controversy. Basically, there are two big users of water. One is agriculture, which uses about 40% of the runoff from the state. And this is the most productive agricultural region anywhere. And I mean, just the San Joaquin and Tulare Lake basins alone produce roughly half the fruits and half of the nuts, for example, in the United States. And it is one of the most productive, economically productive regions anywhere. So so ag uses about 40%, and half then goes to the environment, at least according to the counting system that the Department of Water Resources uses, which is a really bogus counting system. That's a long discussion we can have about this. This includes all the water that runs off on the North Coast where there isn't anybody to use it, but it's tagged as environmental use, and of course, politically, it's described as water wasted to the sea. And yeah, it's a big, complicated thing, which we can deal with in the Q&A. When you look at developed water, though, I mean, that is water which is extracted for consumptive uses. Agricultural accounts for about 80% of that developed water, and urban accounts for 20%. And ag accounts for 2 to maybe 2.5% of California's GDP, and the urban areas account for the rest. And when you think about it, we have Silicon Valley and the LA area. I mean, Silicon Valley alone would be the 14th largest economy in the world. And California in total, its economy is really wrapped up in its cities, particularly on the South Coast and the Bay Area. And that accounts for roughly 98% of the GDP of California, and 20% of the water use. So what I wanted to do after showing you that, I wanted to sort of jump in and give you a 40,000 foot view, because I think that's probably of more use for you. And that 20,000 foot view is, what are the drivers? And so I'm going to ignore all this other stuff like aging infrastructure, flood management, environmental justice issues, disadvantaged communities is a big deal in California, the fights between the federal government and the state government over the last 4 years, permitting chaos, funding, the constant drumbeat of funding, and just sort of step back and say, what's the big picture that's going on? And the big picture that's going on is all about supply reliability. You will not hear me ever say we are running out of water in California. What we're running out of is cheap water in California. It's getting expensive, and it's also becoming more and more unreliable. I'll show you why here in a second. So supply reliability is a key issue. And the three things which are driving supply reliability right now is the existential threat of climate change, which is happening now in California. I hope to convince you of that. The other is groundwater. Because it's such an important drought reserve, sustainable management of groundwater is tugging at this supply reliability question. And then the third rail is ecosystem conditions, Endangered Species Act questions that have really been a tremendous challenge, and we're a long way from being able to solve. So let me just jump right into the climate question. We have been in an unusual period. The flip of the switch in California, we're all arguing about when that occurred, but for the last 22 years, we've been in a period of rather dry conditions, even though average precipitation is about the same. And the reason is we're seeing an increased frequency in dry years, below average years. That's compared to the 20th century average. So when you have that, that has a huge effect on your water supply, particularly for groundwater recharge. That's where it has it's having a major impact. So we're seeing an increased frequency in dry years. And we're also seeing a troubling temperature trend. And that temperature trend is we are in a hot period. And that, for those of you who care about this stuff, it's hugely important, this increase in temperature. Particularly, again, I remind you, it doesn't rain from May to November in California. And what this is doing is it's creating incredibly high evaporative demand in California with these hot temperatures. And that is basically sucking the soil moisture out of large parts of the state, which affects everything in terms of runoff, the water demand. So I and the other guy, Mike Dettinger, have argued that the mega drought that people are talking about that's hitting the Southwest is actually hitting California as well. Its manifestation is mostly an increased frequency in below average years and extraordinarily warm temperatures. And these are hitting us year round. So it's having a very big effect. So this produces 5 climate pressures that are reflected in this most recent drought, which was, by all measures, the drought of the future. It's what they look like. And this is the warming temperatures, shrinking snowpack, shorter wet seasons, more volatile precipitation, and rising seas. So the 3 things we look at, which are all affecting supply reliability now, is this warming. And as I say, this also affects this evaporative demand in the atmosphere. Remember I said earlier that snowpack is a huge part of our storage system. It's integrated into our storage. It's 30% of our water supply comes from snowpack. So that is shrinking, and it's rapidly shrinking. Recent data I just saw this morning is like 30% below long-term averages. It's a pretty steep decline. And then we're also seeing this other phenomenon, a shortening wet season. That is the period of time when precipitation comes is getting narrower and narrower. Our falls are lasting longer and our springs are coming earlier. And that's a big deal because we rely on a handful of large storms, 5 to 7 large storms per year, really decide whether we have a wet year or a dry year. And this year we got like nothing. Well, no, we had one big storm, when we'd normally need 5 to 7 big storms to basically restore our water supply. So that's a big deal for us, or it's having a big impact. The volatility question is something we're just starting to understand. What we're seeing is wetter wets and drier dries. So that's important because in wetter wets, when it's really wet, it's a gully washer, a frog choker, or whatever you call it in the South. No offense. You basically have the inability, you're unable to capture the water and store it because it has to run off into the ocean. You just can't build facilities to get it back in the ground or to store it in reservoirs. And the dry periods are getting drier. And then finally, the thing I'm really not going to talk much about is sea level rise. This is hitting in 2 ways, mostly coastal aquifers, salting up coastal aquifers. And then the other, of course, is the hub of our water supply, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta at the head of the San Francisco estuary. I mean, we rely on a freshwater estuary for a big chunk of our water supply, and sea level rise is pretty much wreaking havoc with that. So those are the big things. So climate change is having a huge effect. So that's one part of the triangle. The second is groundwater. We have in a fit of pique in 1913, when we tried to get our water rights system put together, we've decided to simply the farmers fought very hard, let's put it that way, not to have groundwater included in our overall water rights system. There is no rational reason to separate the two because they are connected. They're very closely connected, and surface water, groundwater connections are vast. It took years for the courts to agree to that, though. But the fact is, it was just the Wild West. It was a property right. If you had groundwater beneath your property, you had a right to drill it. And you still do. You have a right to drill on it. And the problem is we ended up about 5% of our average annual state supply came from overdraft of groundwater. So basically mining groundwater. And that's all the way back in the 1920s that we've been doing that. So the fact is, when droughts come, we use our drought reserve, which is groundwater. But in between, in the wets, we don't put the water back. And so we've had long-term declines, and the epicenter of this has been in the San Joaquin Valley. People call it San Joaquin Valley, but it's the San Joaquin River area and the area to the south, which is the Tulare Basin. So that's been a big impact. So that is the area where you are having heavy over-reliance on overdraft. It also is an area that requires massive infrastructure to import 25% of its supply from that fragile estuary, which is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is being affected by sea level rise. So farming is 25% of the economy in these valleys. So it's really important to everyone. But they've been living off a long-term overdraft of 2 million acre feet per year. So 13% of their supply. And that's gonna have to change. And here's why. There are a lot of additional effects. It's not just groundwater is bad. Basically, we have a variety of key impacts, not the least of which is the lowering of land levels, which are actually destroying the very infrastructure that moves water around. It's degrading that. It's a tragedy of the commons. It also is having huge environmental justice issues for local communities whose wells are drying up. And out of this came the 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And that act has basically said by 2040, you have to have sustainable groundwater management. And there's a long layers of developing groundwater sustainability agencies and groundwater sustainability plans that have to be approved by the state. And if they're not approved by the state can take over your groundwater basin and manage it for you, which nobody's going to like. But it is transformative in what it requires of people in these basins. And it is not going to be easy. There are really tough times ahead to come into this sustainability. If 5% of your supply statewide and 13% of your supply in your richest agricultural region is basically has to go away, because there isn't a way to make up that difference. The work that we've done at PBIC shows that most you can make up a quarter of that through new storage and aggressive recharge. Now you're going to have to start what we call demand management, which is a polite way of saying fallowing land. And so our estimates are that if we just let it happen, roughly 750,000 acres of very productive land is going to have to come out of production in order to achieve balance. Now, if you use really good methods of improving recharge and then lots of trading of water and seasonal fallowing, you can reduce it to 500,000 and reduce its effects. Regardless, this falls heavily on disadvantaged communities because it affects the farm economy, and there are a range of undesirable effects, including continued subsidence, groundwater dependent, drying up of groundwater dependent ecosystems, and air quality issues that have to be managed. And we're just starting to get our heads around this. So this is really a big deal. Fallout from this is, of course, it's part of a reduction in supply reliability. And there is a very large subset of the water user community which has pointed its finger at the environment as being the ultimate cause for this. I can argue why that's not the case, but the fact is they're looking at the environment as a source of water. So it's putting pressure on the environment at this point to basically help solve the supply reliability problem. So let me come to the environment, because this is key. The environment is an incredibly difficult challenge in California to manage, freshwater ecosystems in particular. And because we're such a transformed state, and these are novel ecosystems we're trying to manage. And everything that happens around the environment affects supply reliability. There's tremendous trade-offs, and supply reliability applies to the environment as well. I mean, the ability to deliver water to support native ecosystems in California. And the fact is, for 50 years, almost 50 years, we've been working hard on this. We've been supported by federal law as well as state law, and it's just not working. I mean, there's no polite way to put this, that the conflicts are worse than ever. We have been very focused principally on using the leverage of both the Federal and State Endangered Species Act to basically leverage ecosystem management. And it's not working. We have delisted a whopping total of two species of fish, and one of them was probably a mistake. There are numerous conservation dependent species right now, and many more times, 9 times more freshwater species should be listed in California than are currently listed. And as conditions deteriorate, we're expecting there's going to be a great deal of pressure for more listings in the future, which are highly disruptive. And our recent analysis suggested the next big drought, which we may be at the front end right now, we may lose as many as 18 anadromous and resident fishes, and actually make that 17 because we've already lost one. And they may go extinct in this next drought. So things are really teetering in this regard. And the problem with using the Endangered Species Act as your primary lever for managing these things is it's just not built to cope with changing climate, this increasing volatility that we're seeing, future loss of viability of some species. What do we do about this? I mean, there's a lot of work in the literature about what to do about this, but there's very little action on the ground because we're basically stuck with the Endangered Species Act as this primary lever. What I worry about is that this is going to basically lead to a slew of new listings and a loss of public support for the ESAs. I think that will actually threaten it. And it's also it pits. It's got farmer versus fish written all over it, which is a binary view, which is inherently wrong. People are embedded in these ecosystems, and everyone benefits from healthy ecosystems, whether it's through recreation, drinking water quality, reliability of supply, reduced regulation. There's an array of benefits that come from this. And of course, this fits into the ecosystem services field as they try to consider this stuff. It looks like one of my slides are sort of breaking up in funny ways. This is Zoom, right? If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So is there a better alternative to the law? I think the ESAs are widely acknowledged as an imperfect tool. Is there a way that we can actually anticipate future listings and manage more broadly, and that still meets the mandates of the Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act and other laws? So we published this paper a little while ago, 2 years ago. Actually, no, this particular paper that I'm showing here was actually back in 2017. There's another one following that in 2019, which might be worth looking at. So we have been arguing, the one in particular that we did in 2019, we argued that perhaps there's a different approach. And that is, instead of managing focused narrowly on listed species, we do ecosystem-based management, which is widely used in marine systems and terrestrial forest systems. And that is basically you're managing for ecosystem condition. Your objectives, your metrics are all wrapped around ecosystem condition. And true ecosystem-based management, instead of viewing the environment as a constraint, it is integrated, fully integrated with human uses, placing an emphasis on multi-benefit projects, basically. And our argument in this is that it creates greater net benefits and reduces water quality because of that integration. The key is you're focusing on ecosystem condition rather than listed species. In the papers that we've produced, there's abundant descriptions of the various approaches of ecosystem-based management in freshwater ecosystems. But we have some radical notions. At the top of the list is just to allocate the environment assets that can be flexibly managed. The key thing is the notion of ecosystem water budgets. That is essentially equivalent to a senior water right for the environment that can be managed by storing, trading, deploying it nimbly. To give you an example, one of the problems we have is we've lost flood pulses out of this system. So the ability to take that ecosystem water budget and to deploy it to make small flood pulses, either during the winter or spring snowmelt recession. And of course, that involves connecting structural habitat to functional flows. We have a recent report on functional flows led by Ted Grantham from Berkeley, which is actually worth a read. It's a nice sort of how do you get at functional flows? How do you define them? And how do you manage them? And of course, we fight all the time about the amount of water when it's in fact the quality of water, which is equally important. 100,000 acre feet of warm green water is of very little value if you're managing anadromous fishes. In fact, 10,000 acre feet of cold clear water would be worth much more. So managing those together, which we often don't do, and then the acknowledgement that these are novel ecosystems made up of a mix of native and non-native species that both have to be actively managed is, I mean, it sounds logical, but it's not the way we go at it. And then finally, I'm going to insult some of you by saying most of our ecosystem restoration efforts are not. They are in fact gardening projects because they are not operating at the scale that ecosystems operate at. And that's the big breakthrough we're still waiting for and we're still working on. And there's a lot of interest in it. Anyway, it's the watershed scale. It's getting at the watershed scale. So my general reasons to adopt this notion is that when we use the ESA, we tend to be fixed on the past, not on future conditions, and we tend to be very rigid and it's difficult to change. So using an ecosystem-based management approach, which basically is, again, looking at the holistic approach to the ecosystem, allows us to adapt to change, especially with some of the tools that we described. The notion is to anticipate and reduce new ESA listings. And the way you do this is you make big, broad, connected, messy ecosystems, because that's the way ecosystems are anyways, instead of focusing narrowly on a specific life history of a specific listed fish in a specific area. So again, we're looking to reintroduce complexity and messiness into the environment. And the goal is to integrate human uses with the conservation objectives. And we just don't do enough of that. And this idea actually moves the environment as from a constraint to a partner in water management. We have a number of prescriptions in planning, which include an annual watering plan, which actually gives some flexibility to an ecosystem trustee to manage and sit at the table, to sit at the Waffle House with the water user community and integrate their objectives together. And then finally, I talk about this, but this is what we ran into when we were working on this. Boy, getting the agencies to align their priorities is darn hard. And the notion of an ecosystem-based management in which you are managing to a condition, an ecosystem condition, allows you the opportunity to align the agency projects and really push for multi-benefit projects. We have some explanations for how you might actually get at that. So let me summarize this because I want to leave enough time for questions. There are these, so it's all about supply reliability, okay? And we rely on a very elaborate storage, conveyance, water rights, and environmental laws framework. None of it's younger than 50 years old, and much of it is 100 years old. So it's pretty rigid and it's pretty fixed in place. So, and this affects different sectors and geographic areas differently, this water supply reliability question. But we are facing this ongoing change from climate, in which we now have a warmer climate, which is more volatile and has drier dries and wetter wets, which is affecting supply reliability. We are in the very difficult transition away from groundwater, the use of groundwater, transition away from the overuse of groundwater. We've got to get to sustainability. That is going to have an impact on supply reliability, and that tugs on everything else in the system. And then we still have yet to figure out how to deal with this ecosystem issue especially under rapid change. That is our grand challenge. In fact, those are our grand challenges right there in California water, and I'm sure they apply to the ACF as well. Finally, the last thing I want to say, I do have to leave, and having been in the business as a professor for 35 years at UC Davis, and then I've been at the Water Policy Center for the last 6 years, the fact of the matter is nothing changes except when you have a flood, you have a drought, or you have a lawsuit. Those, in fact, we proposed writing a book titled Flood, Droughts, and Lawsuits, just to basically look at how things change. I think the same is applying to you and the ACF. And these are all pains in the neck to deal with, but they are inflection points. And all of California water policy history wraps around these inflection points, and it's floods, droughts, and lawsuits. And right now we're in the middle of drought and smothered in the lawsuits. So the only thing we're missing is a good flood. So with that, I want to end. Thank you for putting up with this yet another Zoom presentation with all its glitches. And I will be happy to answer questions.